Greetings, friends. In this next segment, we're going to take a look at what the Bible has to say with respect to structural and systemic protections and provisions for immigrants. So in one of our past segments, we've looked at the individual responsibility that we have from a biblical perspective of caring for and loving immigrants. In this segment, we're going to look at a couple of biblical passages which talk about, again, the structural and systemic provisions and protections for immigrants. The first one of these systemic provisions for immigrants is called the Gleaning Laws. The Gleaning Laws. And basically, according to the Gleaning Laws, God told landowners, hey, if you own a whole bunch of land, you're a farmer, leave the edges of your field, all the produce that are around the edges of your field, for immigrants so that they can have something to eat. And secondly, when you go and harvest your crops, when you pick the fields, whatever falls to the ground, leave that as well for immigrants. And so it says in Leviticus 23:22, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. So here again you have the special provision for immigrants, for the poor, in law, in a structural law. Secondly, the Bible states that every 3 years, the entire tithe or donation of produce was to be given to the clergy, to immigrants, orphans, and the widows, quote unquote, so that they can eat in your cities until they are full. So every 3 years, there was supposed to be the special tithe of produce, and that special tithe was to go to feed the vulnerable, to feed immigrants, orphans, and widows, and the clergy. In Old Testament law, you also find God's commandments to protect the immigrants and to treat them equally. Those of you who might know a little bit about constitutional law might be familiar with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the Equal Protection Clause basically says, if states, local governments, or the federal government treat people differently based upon race or national origin, based upon gender, based upon religion, then those laws must pass a special strict test in order to be found constitutional. What a lot of people don't know about is that biblically speaking, God created an equal protection clause specifically for immigrants, to protect immigrants. As far as I know, this is the first type of equal protection clause in the history of law. Leviticus 19:33 through 34 states, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Equal treatment. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And again restated in Leviticus 24:22, you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Again, the same law for the foreigner and the native born. Again, this was to ensure the protection of immigrants in the land. And the Israelites were to understand this because they themselves were enslaved as foreigners in Egypt. And so again, you have in Scripture very clear structural, systemic protections and provisions for immigrants. These special protections were because of the special vulnerability of immigrants in Old Testament times. And the word that scholars often cite in the Old Testament for immigrant is the word ger. The word ger refers to immigrants, and there is this implication of special vulnerability. And that vulnerability arose from the unique situation of the ger in the Middle East. In the economy of that time, you needed to have land, access to land, in order to really produce wealth, to have money. And immigrants were outside of the whole ownership of land, that whole process. And so they were economic outsiders in the agrarian economy. And if there was a famine or poverty or something happened, crop failures, disease, and death, you had to turn to your family for protection, for a safety net, just like today. And back then, if you were an immigrant, you didn't have that safety net. If something went wrong in the agrarian economy, you were in trouble. You would starve and you might die. And so, because of this special vulnerability of immigrants in Old Testament times, again, God provides these special protections, these special provisions, and God even provides the earliest instance of the equal protection laws specifically for immigrants. So that kind of wraps it up for our discussion of structural and systemic protections and provisions for immigrants in the Old Testament. In the next segment, we will apply these principles of protection, these principles of migration as grace, to the history of U.S. immigration law, as well as to contemporary U.S. immigration policy. That will be a couple of segments. Thank you very much. May Jesus bless you. Bye-bye.